The first time I saw Lieutenant Damian Reyes, he was a force of nature, sharp-eyed, disciplined, and commanding a presence that silenced a room. He wasn't the loudest instructor in our military training camp, but he didn't need to be. His authority was woven into the way he carried himself, in a way his steel-gray gaze lingered a second too long when issuing orders. I had been in the program for 3 months, used to early morning drills and the scent of sweat clinging to stiff uniforms. It was a brutal life, but I had chosen it. It was supposed to carve strength into my bones, discipline into my mind. Yet, nothing had prepared me for the sharp twist of uncertainty that came with his attention. At first, it was subtle. A glance held for a beat longer than necessary. A slight nod in my direction when I executed a maneuver with precision. "Good work, Logan," he had said once, his voice even almost impersonal. Almost. I told myself I was imagining it. Reyes was strict but fair, a man who kept his distance. He never played favorites. He didn't let anyone in. But then came the invitation. It was after an exhausting obstacle course session, my lungs burning, uniform damp with sweat. Most of the recruits had already dispersed, eager for their few hours of rest before the next grueling day. I was about to do the same when I heard his voice behind me. I turned so fast my boots scuffed against the dirt. "Sir?" Reyes stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Up close, he was even more intimidating, broad shoulders filling out his fatigues, a scar just below his jawline that I had never noticed before. "You free tonight?" he asked. I blinked. "Sir?" The corner of his mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm grabbing a drink off base. If you're interested." Silence stretched between us, the question hanging in the air like an open-ended dare. My mind raced, trying to decipher the meaning beneath his words. Military instructors didn't socialize with recruits. It was an unspoken rule, and Reyes followed rules with near-religious devotion. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was something I wasn't ready to name. I forced my voice to stay steady. "Yes, sir. Yeah, I'd like that." He nodded once. "Meet me outside the east gate at 2000. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away. The air was thick with summer heat as I waited by the east gate, the chain-link fence casting long shadows beneath the dim streetlights. I had changed into civilian clothes. Nothing special, just jeans and a fitted t-shirt, but somehow it felt different, like armor stripped away. Reyes arrived 5 minutes late, wearing dark jeans and a plain black button-up with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Without his uniform, he looked less like a hardened officer and more like a man who belonged anywhere but a battlefield. "You made it," he said, his voice carrying something softer than command. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied me, his gaze lingering just long enough to make my pulse skip. Then, with a tilt of his head, he motioned for me to follow. We walked in silence, the neon glow of a bar sign flickering up ahead. I should have been thinking about the rules I was breaking, about the way this night could end in regret. Instead, all I could think about was the way his shoulder brushed mine as we stepped inside. The bar was nothing special, dimly lit, the scent of whiskey thick in the air. Reyes ordered for both of us 2 glasses of something dark and burning. I wasn't much of a drinker, but I took a sip anyway, letting the warmth settle in my chest. For a while, we talked about safe things. Training, future deployments, the weight of expectation. But then, somewhere between the second and third drink, the conversation shifted. "Why did you join?" he asked, watching me over the rim of his glass. I hesitated. The usual reasons. I exhaled, setting my glass down. Wanted to prove something. To my father. To myself. Reyes nodded, as if he understood more than I was saying. "And have you?" I wasn't sure how to answer that. I looked at him then, really looked. The way the low light softened the sharp angles of his face. The way his fingers rested against his glass, steady, controlled. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken. I felt it like a static charge in the air, humming between us. I swallowed hard. "Have you?" His lips parted, but he didn't speak right away. For the first time since I'd met him, Reyes looked uncertain, like maybe he, too, had questions he didn't know how to answer. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he said, "Some days." And just like that, the space between us wasn't empty anymore. We left the bar after midnight, the night settling around us like a whispered secret. Reyes walked me back toward the base, our steps slow, unhurried. At the gate, he stopped, turned to face me fully. The silence stretched, charged and fragile. "Logan," he said, my name a weight between us. I didn't know what I expected him to say next. Maybe a warning, maybe a dismissal. But what I didn't expect, what I never could have imagined, was what actually happened. Reyes reached out, his fingers grazing my wrist, just barely there. It was brief, fleeting, but it shattered something inside me. Because for all his control, for all his discipline, that single touch spoke volumes. A choice, a temptation, a line waiting to be crossed. And the worst part? I want to cross it. I told myself it was nothing. A drink, a conversation, a moment that meant less than it felt. But I was lying. After that night, Lieutenant Damian Reyes was everywhere. Not in the obvious sense, he never broke protocol, never let his guard slip in front of others. But when his eyes met mine across the training field, when his voice called my name in that measured tone, I felt something shift. I should have buried it. I should have ignored the way my pulse quickened when he was near. But the thing about desire is that once it's acknowledged, it doesn't go away. It only grows. 2 weeks passed before it happened again. It was late, the rest of the recruits already in their barracks. I had stayed behind at the gym, working through my exhaustion, trying to sweat out the tension coiling in my gut. The rhythmic clang of weights, the sharp exhale of my breath, these were things I could control. Unlike him, I had just finished my last set when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, already knowing who it would be. Reyes stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You always push yourself this hard." I grabbed my towel, wiping the sweat from my face. Only when I need to clear my head. "Is it working?" It wasn't. I shrugged. "Mostly." He nodded, stepping further inside. The air between us seemed heavier in the quiet space, thick with something unspoken. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Walk with me." It wasn't an order, but I followed him anyway. Outside, the night was cool, the distant hum of the bass settling into silence. Reyes walked beside me, his stride slow, deliberate. "You ever feel like you're two different people?" he asked. I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "Like there's the version of you everyone sees. The one who follows the rules, does what's expected. And then there's the other version. The one that thinks about things he shouldn't." Something about the way he said it sent a current through me. Yeah, I admitted. I know the feeling. Reyes stopped walking. When I turned to face him, his expression was careful. Too careful. Like he was calculating the weight of every word before speaking. "I don't do this," he said. My pulse kicked. "Do what?" His jaw tensed. "This." A vague gesture between us. "I don't cross lines. I don't." He trailed off, shaking his head. I should have ended it there. I should have made it easy for him. Instead, I said, "Neither do I." Silence stretched, tight, and loaded. Then, so fast I barely had time to react. He reached for my wrist, his fingers barely brushing my skin. A ghost of the touch from 2 weeks ago, but this time he didn't pull away. My breath caught. I could have stepped back. I could have pretended it didn't happen. But I didn't. Instead, I let the moment settle between us, heavy with the things we weren't saying. "Logan," he murmured, my name rough in his throat. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance. It was tentative at first, a hesitation, a question neither of us was brave enough to ask aloud. But the second Reyes responded, the second he pressed back, it became something else entirely. His grip tightened on my wrist, pulling me closer, and suddenly, restraint didn't exist. His mouth was warm, insistent, and for a moment the rest of the world dissolved. No ranks, no rules, just him. And God, I wanted more. But then he broke away, breathing hard. Shit. His hand was still on my wrist, like he couldn't decide whether to let go. "This is a mistake." I swallowed against the knot in my throat. "Then why did you let it happen?" His eyes flickered, caught between want and guilt. "I don't know." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, with visible effort, he took a step back. "I need to go," he said. But even as he said it, His gaze lingered on my mouth, as if already regretting the space between us. "Okay," I said, though nothing about this felt okay. He hesitated once more before turning, walking away without another word. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, replaying every second of that kiss, the way his body had felt against mine, the way his fingers had gripped my skin like he was afraid to let go. I told myself it was over, that he would shut it down, pretend it never happened. But the next morning, when our eyes met across the training field, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not even close. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. That night in the dark, with Lieutenant Damian Reyes' lips against mine, had been a moment of weakness, nothing more. A lapse in judgment fueled by adrenaline, exhaustion, and unspoken loneliness. And yet, it did happen again. It started with stolen glances, subtle but deliberate. His gaze would find mine across the training field, his expression neutral, unreadable to anyone else. But I knew better now. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the quiet battle between reason and desire. I was fighting the same one. At first, we kept our distance. For days, we acted as if nothing had happened, our interactions clipped professional. But there was a charge in the air, an awareness neither of us could ignore. Then one night my phone buzzed. "Reyes, Eastgate, 2200. It wasn't a question. I stared at the message longer than I should have. I knew what meeting him again would mean, what would set in motion. I should have ignored it. Instead, I found myself slipping out into the night, my pulse hammering with every step. Reyes was waiting, leaning against the chain-link fence, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. For a moment, we just stood there, neither of us speaking. Then, with quiet resignation, he said, "Tell me to walk away." I didn't. Instead, I closed the distance between us, and this time there was no hesitation. The moment our lips met, everything else disappeared. The risks, the consequences, the world outside of us. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer, and I let him. I let myself sink into him, into the heat of his touch, the quiet desperation laced in every movement. We didn't stop. Not that night. Not in the weeks that followed. The affair consumed us. It was reckless, dangerous, fueled by the sharp contrast between restraint and indulgence. In daylight, we were nothing more than instructor and recruit, careful and controlled. But when night fell, we became something else entirely. We found ways to steal moments, to carve out time where there was none. A brush of fingers in passing. A midnight rendezvous behind the storage facility. The rush of hurried kisses in the shadows, where rules didn't exist. Every encounter left me wanting more, left me more tangled in the mess we were making. But with the thrill came the guilt. Reyes never spoke about the life he had outside of this, but I knew it was there. The first time I'd seen the faint tan line on his ring finger, I had pretended not to notice. But the knowledge lingered in the back of my mind, a weight pressing heavier with each meeting. I should have ended it. I didn't. One night, after another secret meeting, we sat in his car, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Reyes exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This can't last." The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "I know." He turned to me, then his jaw tight. "Do you?" I didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since this started, the weight of reality settled between us. This wasn't just dangerous. It was inevitable in the worst way. We were both standing at the edge of something that could destroy us. And yet, when he reached for me, I let him. Because some part of me, the part that craved him despite the wreckage we were causing, didn't care. The next morning, as I stood in formation, Reyes walked past without sparing me a glance. But something was different. His shoulders were tense, his movements rigid. Something was unraveling, and I could feel it in my bones. That night, when I checked my phone, there was no message. No invitation. For the first time in weeks, I felt the first real pang of fear. Something was coming, and I wasn't ready. The silence lasted 3 days. 3 days without a message. 3 days without stolen glances, without whispered words in the dark. Lieutenant Damian Reyes had disappeared into the rigid structure of command, and I had forced myself to follow suit. but the absence burned. I told myself it was for the best, that maybe he had finally come to his senses. I repeated the lie until it almost sounded true. And yet, when I saw him standing near the training field that evening, his posture tense, his expression unreadable, I knew something had shifted. I wasn't ready for what came next. I barely had time to step away from the other recruits before he spoke. "Logan, my office." Now, the words were sharp, clipped. A few of the others cast me wary glances, but no one said anything. Reyes wasn't the kind of man you questioned. I followed him in silence, my stomach a knot of unease. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the tension in the air became suffocating. He stood behind his desk, hands braced against the surface, head bowed. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, without looking at me, he said, "This has to end." I swallowed hard. I thought it already had. His head snapped up, his gaze locking onto mine. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." His fingers curled into fists against the desk. "My wife knows." The words hit harder than I expected. I had always known about her, of course. She was the unspoken truth between us, the shadow lurking at the edge of every stolen moment. But hearing it aloud, hearing the weight of it in his voice, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I took a step back. "How?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "She found my phone. The messages. She confronted me last night." My heart pounded. "What did you tell her?" Reyes let out a hollow laugh. "What did I tell her? That it was a mistake? That it didn't mean anything?" His eyes darkened. "She didn't believe me, because it would have been a lie." The air in the room felt too thick, pressing down on me. "What happens now?" He shook his head. "I don't know. She hasn't reported anything. Yet. But if she does..." He didn't have to finish the sentence. We both knew what that would mean. His career. My future. Everything. For the first time since this began, I saw it. Fear. Not just guilt. Not just conflict. But real, tangible fear in his eyes. And beneath it, something else. Something raw. I should have walked away right then. I should have let it end. But instead, I stepped closer. "Tell me you don't want this." His breath hitched. I reached for him, my fingers grazing his wrist. The same touch that had started this whole mess. "Tell me you regret it," I whispered. He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. The regret wasn't in what we had done. It was in the fact that we couldn't stop. That night, against all logic, against every consequence looming over us, we met one last time. It wasn't like the other nights. There was no thrill, no reckless urgency. Just a quiet desperation, a need to hold on to something that had already started slipping away. He kissed me like he was memorizing it, like he knew it was the last time he'd ever get the chance. And when it was over, he pulled away first. "This is it," he said, his voice raw. "It has to be." I nodded, even though it felt like a lie. "I know." We didn't say goodbye. We just let the silence settle, heavy and final. And then, without another word, he was gone. The next morning, Reyes acted as if nothing had happened. No lingering glances. No hesitation in his voice when he addressed me in front of the others. I had expected it, but it didn't make it hurt any less. By the end of the week, I heard the news he had requested a transfer. It was approved. By the end of the month, he was gone. No messages. No explanations. Just a ghost of something that had once burned too brightly. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself I would forget. But late at night, when the world was quiet and my thoughts were too loud, I still felt his hands on me. Still heard my name in his voice. Some affairs end in disaster. Some in heartbreak. Ours ended in silence. And somehow that was worse.